Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people, some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
At the age of 3, Ed Hajim was kidnapped by his father, driven across country, and was told his mother was dead. And then, not too much later, he was virtually abandoned by his dad. Many years later, business entrepreneur Ed Hajim received the Horatio Alger Award for exemplifying the values of initiative, leadership, and commitment to excellence despite personal adversity. Hajim's the author of On the Road Less Traveled, an unlikely journey from the orphanage to the boardroom. It's a memoir that describes the improbable story of how he bounced from foster homes to orphanages. It was a struggle, a daily struggle to survive. But Hajim flourished, ultimately becoming an accomplished Wall Street executive and a model family man. And now he's giving back to a world that seemed intent on rejecting him. On the Road Less Traveled is packed with stories of how Hajim used his ingenuity to achieve his goals, like wangling a free plane trip to the West Coast, purportedly for an interview for a job he didn't want. He just needed the money so he could get there to be the best man at his friend's wedding. I just cracked up when I read that. Oh, man. Talk about ingenuity. Whew. No wonder this guy became a really good business tycoon. Wow. Hajim's the son of a Syrian immigrant and now has more than 50 years' experience in the financial industry. His bio reads like a who's who of major investment companies in which he's held senior management or ownership positions. Ed Hajim, thanks for being with us today on Lean to the Left. It's a pleasure to speak.
No, Bob, thanks for having me. I appreciate it very much. You've done your homework.
Yeah, I really did enjoy your book. I interviewed dozens and dozens of authors, and many times I'm fortunate enough to receive their books, and I try to read them. I skim through them, but your book held me. It really did, and I congratulate you on your work. I know that you are not a professional writer. Your career was in finance and investment and all that mysterious stuff. Stuff that's mysterious to me.
It was mysterious to me for a while as well, because I was an engineer from the start.
Oh,
It took me 7 years to write the book. It was a labor of love, trust me.
Okay. It took you, 7 years, did you say?
More than 7 years, actually.
Yeah,
it was
okay.
And we have I used to be embarrassed about recommending it, but I get comments like yours. I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. So we sold 15,000 copies, which my publicist says is very good for a non-celebrity. I spent my time trying to live hidden, staying away from the newspaper, staying away from television and so forth. So when she took me on, she says, "No one knows you," which wasn't so positive.
There you go. But 15,000 copies, that is really...
I guess it's good. I don't know anything about the publishing business, but we have sold 15,000 copies in about 18 months.
Wow, that's pretty good. I believe that is. Okay. Now let's see here. Your life is filled with a whole bunch of twists and turns. Now tell us a story about how you were kidnapped by your dad. You were only 3 years old. What was going on?
It starts way back. I'm going to try to leave that out. Dad came as an immigrant, got fascinated by technology called radio, did extremely well in the 20s, was very wealthy. He had the picture with his airplane and so forth. Lost everything in 33, between 29 and 33. Went across country, met my mom. 2 weeks later, he married her, carried her off to California. But the losing of the money and the Middle Eastern mentality and the whole works was just too much. And he couldn't keep a job and so forth. So after I was born, 3 years after they were married, 6 years after, my mother said, just too much, can't handle it any longer. It was extremely difficult to deal with. She decided to get divorced. So she got divorced and she got custody, and he got $5 a week and visiting rights on Sunday. So she took me from Los Angeles, where we were living, to St. Louis. He shows up on his Sunday visit after driving 1,800 miles in a Ford 1936 Roadster. Sees me, doesn't believe that I'm really well kept, gets back on. Instead of taking me to a movie, he gets on the highway and he takes me back to Los Angeles. Calls my mother, tells her not to look for us, and basically says to me sometime later that she died. And I believed that for 57 years. So that's the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
And could go on about it, but that's the beginning story. Dad and I lived in hotel rooms and motel rooms, and I lived with the neighbors. He was a radio operator aboard a ship. So even during the 2 years we lived together before the war, he was away most of the time.
Yeah. Now, did you ever find your mom?
It's a great story. My dad died in 1971. He died of a heart attack suddenly, bang, done. And I got to the apartment and we sorted out his things. And there was a suitcase full of all my letters. And I started to go into them and I just couldn't handle it. So I closed the suitcase up. 1971, 25 years later, when I'm 60 years old, my wife threatened to throw the suitcase away. She's a thrower-awayer person. She cleans out things regularly. And luckily it was a rainy Sunday, so I went into it and I found a package of letters I didn't recognize. And it turns out there was the idea that my mother was divorced and she didn't die. So I hired a special detective, Schlang and Company, and they went back to St. Louis and they found her. She was 81 years old, and her second husband had just died. And they wrote me and said, "We think this is your mother." So I spent a better part of 2 months deciding whether I want to let this woman into my life, because my father described her as being terrible. Why would I? Here I was, a successful guy, had a family, had a wife. Why do I want to mess around and bring someone like this in? But Barbara and I decided we would do it. And it turns out, she turns out to be a very nice lady, very good sense of humor. And it did wonderful things for me because it taught me that I wasn't only my father, I was this other person. And she had some very different characteristics, which I had, which I couldn't find. So it was a really wonderful. She lived for 12 years, and she became partners with Barbara's aunt and mother, who were in their 90s as well. And she lived to 92, and Barbara's mother lived to 98, and Barbara's aunt lived to 95. And the Three Musketeers were touring around for 12 years together. So it was wonderful. And she was a character. But she was a thinker and not a feeler. So when my father kidnapped me, she felt that baby, since she was not very well, she was not happy with her parents. Her parents didn't really want to see her. At 1939, you don't want to see anybody, especially somebody with a 3-year-old child. And my father was a feeler and not a thinker. He didn't realize what a 3-year-old was, what the responsibility was. He wanted me. And so that's what happened at that point in time.
So your father was a feeler, not a thinker. Are you a feeler or a
That's what's so wonderful is that my mother, I'm a little more of a thinker than I have both, which is interesting. I'm quite emotional, but I do a lot of thinking. This is what the book is all about too. And the second book that I've written is thinking about things. I would sit and write down my thoughts every year just about. I believe that, and I'm passing that on to young people. Do more writing, do more thinking about yourself, about your family, about your work, about giving back. As I call it, the 4 parts of life. You've got to do a lot of thinking about all of them because they're all quite complicated.
Ultimately, did your relationship with your dad improve? What happened?
Dad was all I had, and he gave me, the first ghostwriter wanted me to hate my father. I didn't hate him. I loved him. It was all I had. And even though he abandoned me 3 specific times completely, he went to sea, he disappeared when I was 15 and so on. But every letter he ever wrote me, every conversation we had, he kept telling me how great I was, what a wonderful person I was. And he had rules like cleanliness is next to godliness, always take care of yourself, eat the right foods. So he sent messages which were very positive, and he gave me unconditional love. One of my letters when I was 10 years old, it's in the book, basically, said, "Dad, I'm not always a good kid," because I got tired of him saying, "You're wonderful, it's always the other people's fault, not your fault," and so on. So he gave me unconditional love. We started to grow apart when after my college, I was in the Navy for 3 years, and I left the Navy. And he said, not a good idea. He was very upset with me because when he left the Navy, that was the best part of his life. And then when I left engineering to go to business school, he was further negative on me. Then we had a complete falling out when I married my wife, because I guess she looked a little like my mother, and she came from the same part of the world too. And he was very upset about that, and he disagreed with me marrying her. So we moved apart. We were estranged, but we grew back together once I had a couple of kids, and he came up and so forth. It never was a warm relationship after all those years. And of course, as I got older, I realized that he hadn't really done what he should have done for me. But he died suddenly, which was very sad. I didn't believe in my area you didn't go and get help. But after he died, I went and got help. And the woman was fabulous. For 6 months, I wrote letters to him. And I then wrote letters back from him. I wrote the letters. I took those letters to the gal, the Ackerman Institute in New York, and she would analyze. So I'd ask these questions to him, and I'd try to answer them myself. After 6 months, I was able to cope with the fact that he died suddenly and I didn't have closure.
Okay. How did the adversity that you went through with that personal family relationship, how did that affect your life?
Well, that's what I pitch these young people that don't have the best of backgrounds. I think a lot of my disadvantages became advantages. Think about being in 18 to 20 different places before you're 18 years old. What do you develop? You develop adaptability. When you go from one schoolyard to the next, you learn how to get into the group again. If you go to another schoolyard, you really have now become professional in that. So I actually I seek change. I understand change. I'm not afraid of change because of those many changes. And there were terrifically different circumstances. The first foster home was terrible. The last one was great. Some of the schools were better than the other. Getting on an airplane, flying to New York, living in the YMCA for a summer with God knows what kind of people in New York City. No, all those things were positive. So that basically gave me adaptability. In my business career, I was not afraid to take on any responsibility. Some of the big mistakes I made was not being afraid of taking on certain responsibilities. But it also gave me resilience. Resilience is a muscle. If you go through a childhood which is difficult like mine, you gain resilience. You gain perseverance. And if you get through it, you have a certain amount of self-confidence. And also you appreciate. I really, when you go through that kind of, you appreciate everything. Even though when I went to college, it was not a great start. It was better than the orphanage. So you appreciate the next step every time. And so I've been very lucky in my own career. And so I appreciate it. I have gratitude now for all things. So those things. Now you do have some things in your childhood which you have to overcome. I had anger, and most young people who go through what I went through had anger because you wake up in the morning, every morning you say, why me? Why am I in an orphanage? Why am I treated like this? Why? When we were in the orphanage, we had these signs on our head, kids from the home, and certain mothers wouldn't let you date their daughters and so on and so forth.
You had what? Signs on your head?
When you went from the orphanage, and you were in the neighborhood, you basically had a sign on your head that said, this kid's in the orphanage. So
okay.
His mother want you to take her daughter out. Hell no. Why could you get somebody regular? What a family and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Anyway, but why me? But you have to take that anger, and that's again what you said. A lot of thinking to channel that anger, not externally, channel it internally toward doing better, and that of course gives you energy. So that was actually a positive as well. It was a negative for a while. As early I was an angry young man, and I threw tennis rackets and growled a lot. Even when in the business, I threw telephone occasionally. But you overcome it, and you realize you channel that energy back into being successful. But it also helped me in understanding. What I went through, I just met a lot of different kinds of people. When I was in the Navy, I could relate to all the enlisted men because no matter what kind of background they had, I could feel for them and understand them. Same thing in business. And it allows you to read a resume really well.
Yeah. When you were trying to come up with money for Harvard Business School, for example, you went through a period there where you didn't have any money. You were scrounging around from job to job, right?
I got out of the Navy, and I'd saved up a couple grand in the Navy. I worked a year as an engineer at Hercules, saved another car. I had $5,000, and I wanted to go to Harvard Business School, and that was the tuition for 1 year. And so I applied, and somehow I got in. In those days, they didn't have scholarships. So I arrived at the Harvard Business School, and I walked in, and I said, I just have enough money for tuition. I haven't got money for tomorrow's breakfast. The guy grimaced at me in those days in 19 they weren't that happy with you if you didn't have money, because everybody, it seemed to, everyone of my classmates went to Princeton, I think. But I said, I really don't want to work, because I worked all through college and I really felt I didn't get all the education I wanted, flipping hamburgers and working in a library and the laundry and so forth. And the guy said that was a sympathetic deal, so they lent me money for the second year tuition and gave me a stipend to live on. So I owed him money when I left business school, but it was a better deal than having to work at the point. And I worked the summer between business school, had a pretty good job, and made some money there. But I refused to work, physically work, because in high school I worked in all kinds of jobs. People said, "What's your worst job?" Being a pin boy with no pin setters.
Oh, tell me about it. Oh, with no pin setters. Oh, yeah. I was a pin boy back in the day. Yeah.
It's one of the best paying jobs. You got paid per line. And that was a pretty good deal. You had to hire behind that barrier, and the pins bounced off the barrier and came running out and put them back on again.
I only got paid 10 cents.
10 cents a line. I think that's what it was.
Yeah, I did mine in France. My dad was in the military, and my first job was a pin setter in the post bowling alley. Yeah, and wait till I tell you this story. And then I got a job working in the PX. I was a security guard.
Oh.
The reason why they hired a security guard was because 45 RPM records kept making their way out the door without stopping. Yeah, without stopping at the cash register. And miraculously, when they hired me as a security guard, those thefts just stopped. And I was the chaplain's kid. It would have been a major scandal if anything.
That's really funny. You were the chaplain's son? Wow.
Yeah. All right. But this podcast is about you now.
Oh, but that's great. That's what I found when I buy books. I've learned more about people. They write back. I get long emails about them. I could write a book.
Oh, yeah.
People read my book.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. Let me see here. Where was I? You write that sometimes you need to know when a partnership has run its course. Now, we're jumping ahead because now with this question, you're in business and you're running the show at these companies. But at one point, I recall in your book, you talk about how you left a job, or I left a...
Yeah.
And it was more than a job. I think you were running the place, but I don't remember exactly. At any rate, you write that sometimes you need to know when a partnership has run its course, and it's better to sever ties and leave on your own, even if you don't know what you're doing next. Then you say that's often the road less traveled, but it's so worth the journey. What were you referring to? Can you explain what you were referring to?
Almost all through my life, I had a couple of tenets which I used in working. One was the people, probably the most important thing. The second thing was where the people were going. And I can cite a couple things to express what you just looked at. One was at E.F. Hutton. I really liked the CEO, was a buddy of mine. We talked almost every day, but he was going in the wrong direction. And after 3 years, I said, Bob, it's not working. You want to stay in retail business, and the future is institutional. And I was the institutional manager, and I said, we just can't do that. And Lehman Brothers at the time was out to hire somebody to start their institutional business, and they were offering me everything under the sun. And I went to my boss. I said, "You got to take the institutional business and take it." No, we've done enough of that. You're affecting my whole company. I said, I'm profitable, and it's the future. So I left Hutton to go to Lehman, which probably wasn't a good idea because Lehman was a pretty tough place. And in Lehman, my partner there was a guy that I didn't like. So the people part of it was negative from the very beginning. And he didn't like me. In fact, in the book called Greed and Glory on Wall Street, it says Glucksman hated Hajim. And we were both partners. I was on the board of directors. I had almost as much stock as he had and so on. But he hated me, supposedly. Mm-hmm. And we struggled for 7 years. And here again, this was severing. They were going in the right direction, but he wasn't. So I severed that relationship. And then finally, when I sold the company to ING, it was the very end of my career, I got to the point where it just wasn't wasn't really working. They didn't understand the U.S. market. They had split my company in half and so forth. And it was time for me to leave. I've had someone said, you read my book, you really couldn't keep a job. Really wasn't true. I was 20 years at Furman Cells, which is another whole story. When I left Lehman Brothers, it was very important to me to go back and think about who I am and what I wanted. I could have gone to another prestigious firm. Instead, I went to a little tiny firm called Furman Cells, where my office, instead of looking over the entire harbor, looked at a brick wall. And the dining room, instead of being guys in white gloves and the finest dining room on Wall Street, it was a couple of hot plates in the conference room. But that's what I really wanted to do. But I was there for 20 years now, different iterations. I was there for 5 years as an independent. We sold it to Xerox. Then we basically bought it back. So another 5 years, we finally sold to ING, and I was at ING for 4 or 5 years. But each time I had these two main principles, the people and where they're going. And they're going in the right direction. And we at Furman Cells, we went in the right direction for 20 years. And so I stayed there. But because I was directing the store there, because I was the CEO. I guess one of my tenets is I wanted freedom. That's one reason I went to Furman Cells. I didn't want people over me, or I didn't want a lot of politics also. So those are kind of what you do basically is you start to understand yourself and what really you're good at and what you really want. And I found that in my mid-business career, I found that out, luckily, and went to a smaller firm, and we built it for 20 years, basically. But that's, as you say, it's worth the journey, and try to leave on your own terms. Each case, I wasn't fired, but I left, and then I had time to use my energy to figure out what the famous words at the end of my book, what's next? That's the most important thing you do in your life is what's next? Stop, think, and ask what's next. What's next can be the same thing you're doing now, but regularly on a 3 to 4 or 5 year basis, especially to now with technology and so forth, what's next becomes somewhat different. And of course, you get to a certain age like you and I, you find out there's something else out there, like writing a book.
Yeah, that's right. You've done pretty well with your book, and I congratulate you on that, because being an independent author, I can tell you from experience, is a difficult task.
I lose money on each book I sell. Get that? It's the most terrible business I've ever been in my life.
It's not as bad as podcasting.
Okay. I won't do any podcasting, thank you.
All I do is spend money on various aspects, and what comes back is
no. When I signed,
not even peanuts.
They got me a publisher. I was going to self-publish, and you got a publisher, and the guy was very excited about it. He gave me a big stipend up front, $1,000, and then he took 90% of the revenues. I said, doesn't sound so good to me.
That's not a good deal, no. But all right, so I want to get back to a couple of things. One line struck me that I found in your book, and I've heard this many times in my business career. The only constant in life is change. People change and business change. If you don't adapt, you will not survive. Sounds to me like you said that your trek through all these different companies, some people said, well, you couldn't hold a job. I found it to indicate that this guy knows how to take the next step, whether it's away or creating something new or whatever. Somehow within him, he had the insight to know when that change was needed. Am I right there?
Exactly. And I think that's absolutely essential for being successful. You've got to be sensitive to the waves and the cycles and the themes that are playing out. You sit still too long and you don't change. And I used to kid about this at Furman Cells. I said, you got to jump to the next lily pad almost every year, because lily pads get full and then they sink. You got to keep going and figure out what's next all the time, or else you really do lose out. I'm a Rochester person. I'm at the University of Rochester. Kodak is a perfect example. It was a great company that sat still and died. Polaroid the same way. In my book, I talk about CDs. People there were CDs forever. You can't even find a CD. You can't find a CD player today. Music has changed. So change is very important, especially the technology. I'm trying to get the school, Rochester is going to teach a life design course, which I'm very excited about. I want to teach a course in technology and its effect on the system, because it really changed. Go back to the 15th century, without printing press, you never would have had Protestantism. And today, the amount of this whole AI thing is huge. And it's going to change everything. Digitalization is changing everything. Zooming is changing everything. So I think that technology and change is so vital to everybody's career today. And I think that they have to pay attention to it. And I was very lucky. Early on in investing, I said the way to make money, big money, was to find a theme or an unsatisfied demand or a need that was not being satisfied. And by the way, it's not necessarily only money and finance and so forth. A friend of mine he does surgery on curvature of the spine. So he found one of the greatest demand was in Africa. And 30 years ago, he went to Africa. He was one of 2 surgeons that did that kind of work. And he's got a huge booming business. Doesn't make a lot of money, but he's saved a lot of lives and changed a lot of lives. But he found a place where there was great demand for what he wanted to do. And I think that's what you have to find out. I kid about this, but the golf course I got founded in Nantucket, one of the big positives, there was latent demand for golf. People say, you're crazy. You can't pay that much money for land. Nobody's going to pay that much money for membership. There's just huge demand for golf on Nantucket. We were wildly successful.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. If you want, I'll send you my book on Nantucket Golf Course. It really is an interesting story.
Well, sure, I'd love to have that.
We're the largest charity on the island now, which is pretty impressive for a golf course.
That is. You've also, talking about giving back, you've also donated a ton of money to the University of Rochester.
I was very fortunate enough that when I became the chairman of the board, I wouldn't have been the chairman of the board. I went in and said, who gave the largest gift in the history of the university? And they said, George Eastman. I said, I'm going to give a little bit more than he did, of course, in nominal dollars. But they can make the statement that I gave the largest gift. And, of course, we then had a capital campaign, and that was one of the nice things that got it going in the right direction. But it was, to me, it's all for scholarships. A scholarship changed my life. So I've given scholarships at 10 different institutions, and I think that's still the most important thing. You take the kid who makes it to 17 or 18 and can't take the next step, give him that little extra money that allows him to do that. I think that really is a life changer as far as I'm concerned. But he's got to get to, or he or she has to get to that point. I think the other problems at the lower levels are significant too, but I can't do it all, so that's where I focus my charity. I think there are 10 different places where down to Westchester Community College, Brunswick School. These are all schools, but University of Rochester, Denver, Vermont, Harvard.
Wow. Hey, you know what, Ed? Back 70 years ago, let's just say 75 years ago, whatever, would you ever have dreamed that you would be talking today about donating millions of dollars to colleges and universities when you didn't even have enough money to buy a popsicle?
I am so grateful. People said, well, you're my age, how are you? I said, I'm grateful. I never dreamed, I didn't have one house, and at one point in my life, I had 4 of them, or almost 5. No, that's why I tell people, the reason I wrote this book, people give me one line, anything is possible in America. So that's my main theme. Education is my second line, is education is a solution to everything. Those 2 lines make it up, and then never be a victim. Those are 3 lines that I tell people you can get out of my book, and it's really the answer. But I never dreamed ever that I would ever get to this point. And also, having 3 children and 8 grandchildren, when I had no relatives, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, nobody. And now I have, and then finding my mother, one of the funny stories was she called up her son when she had the second husband, said, maybe Phil, remember that brother you always wanted? I found him for you. And of course, Phil he was 50 and I was 70, and so we become very close friends. And I've got another family. He has 3 sons, and we've come close to his kids and so on. Never ever dreamed that I would have my 50th reunion and have 20 people for a couple of days of celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary. It's that I never dreamed of. Then giving the largest gift in the history of Rochester is the kid arrived with a sport jacket, a leather jacket, and a black leather jacket, and a suitcase for the wrong clothes, and immediately tried to get a job in the kitchen. And the first year I was rejected by all the fraternities because I didn't have any of them. I had no smooths at all.
Okay, now people get this picture. Now, here's a guy who shows up at the University of Rochester, right?
University of
University of
Rochester in Rochester, New York. By the way, I didn't want to go there. I wanted to go to Cornell or RPI, but the Naval Scholarship only gave 4 years of payment, so I couldn't. Both the other two wanted 5 years, so Rochester said they'll get me through in 4, so I went there. Never going to the school. Arrived by bus.
Okay. Okay. So the guy shows up in the wrong clothes, wearing the wrong jacket, feeling like a schmuck. And then, what, how many years later? 50 years later? 50 years later, the guy's making, how much did you donate? 30 million. 30 million. All right. So here's the guy, the guy now has what? Do you said 5 houses or 4 houses?
No, I'm down to 2 now, but I had one.
He's down to 2. He was
down to 2 now.
How many jet airplanes you got?
No, I fly private, but that's. I'm blessed. Come on, one young fellow said to me, he said, "Are you think you're lucky or blessed?" I said, "I'm both."
Here he goes. I'm blessed. I fly private. Okay.
Secret stuff now, Bob. Now let's stay on the surface here.
Oh yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about your new book, The Island of the Four Ps, a modern fable about preparing for your future. All right, there it is, The Island of the Four Ps. So tell me, what's the point of this book, and what's the
original book that I wrote, but the ghostwriter, a couple ghostwriters said, you got to write your biography first, so I did. This book was written back in 2015, 2016. What I believed then, this is basically a result of my graduation. I talked at 80 graduations over the 10-year period I was at Rochester, and I needed something to talk about. And I went back and said, how the hell did I do what I did? And I found out that there was a structure that I used. I looked at my yellow pads and so forth, my decision making, and I came up with the 4 Ps: passion, principles, partners, and plans. Find your passions, establish your principles, find your necessary partners, and then develop your plans and write those down. And I said there are 4 parts of life, 4 buckets of life: self, family, work, and community, which is the Y word for giving back. And basically, I decided to write a book on that. And I decided, instead of writing a here's how to do it book, I decided to write a fable like Who Moved My Cheese or The Alchemist, where it was something that people would be more interesting. And I didn't want it to be a book, this is what you do. No, I wanted a book, this is how you do it. And each person's individual. Each person's passion is different. And you have to decide what your passions are and what your principles are. And, what your partners are. And, the partners, find someone to love. P1, as I call her. So the book, that's the book. And it's a story about a young man who is on a boat, and it's obviously me. He's got a navigator and a captain, which is obviously supposedly his mother and father, not my case. Lands on an island, runs into an older man who's his guide, and they go to these 4 villages. And in each village, they talk about passion, principles, partners, and plans. It's a fable. Obviously, it's a fiction. But each time they talk about things, it allows the person reading the book to start to think about their own situation. And I think and I believe very seriously, there's only one constant in life besides change, or even more than change, is your inner voice. And I think it's important that you develop a vocabulary. This may be a little esoteric, vocabulary for your inner voice, so that when you say something, it puts it in a box and you go back and look at that box. So I have these 8 boxes now: self, family, work, and community. And then the 4 Ps: passions, principles, partners, and plans. And I'm going to, as a third book, and the third chapter in the third book is going to be the balance is bull. There's no such thing as balance. You're always out of balance. Because to be successful, you must focus. And as soon as you focus on one thing, other things get less attention and become out of focus. So people who work too hard on their business normally don't have a good family life. So it's very important to know how out of balance you are. Not, let's say, I'm in balance. You're never in balance, by definition. Almost time you're dealing with crisis in family, you'll find that your work will suffer. Me, I closed down my business when I came basically to be the chairman of the board of University of Rochester. I was no longer going to focus on the work. I was going to focus on giving back, and I was going to give that full time. And people that don't do that end up doing a poor job on both of them. So the book is interesting. I'm doing an audio version of it, too, with 7 voices, which is going to be really fun. And if I have my way, I might do an animated film, because the characters in it are humorous, and they're interesting. And you can develop a feeling that, that you're basically an older man's talking to a younger man, and they may be the same because one has experience and the other one doesn't. And are you really talking to yourself, looking back over your background? But it's important that the older man never says this is what you should do. He continues to pressure the younger man to make his own decisions. And then we have a young lady that shows up in the middle of the book too, so that's fun.
That sounds like a fascinating book.
It's an easy read. It's 150 pages. Illustrations are really, the gal who did the illustrations. There's the island.
Yeah, I see it. Okay.
There's something called a testamark. The older man gives him this device which he puts a P into it, and the P then becomes a pearl. And it basically, if you press that P, it brings up a screen and keeps track of your thoughts. So what the testamark is, it's your mind.
Okay.
We all collect stuff, except we don't do a good job of it because we forget things. But this thing doesn't do that. And I think in future, that's one of the things that people have to do. They've got to make sure that they recognize what their passions were, how they change. And I go through that in a speech that I make when I give graduation speeches. I used to go back and when I was in high school, my first passions came for baseball, basketball, math, science, and girls. And then when I went to college, that morphed, changed. Math and science morphed into engineering. Baseball and basketball my freshman year morphed into extracurricular activities. And girls stayed until I got married. But those are the kinds of things people have to recognize, that as you go on through life, your passions change. But in addition, in the plans section, I make a very big point is one of the most important things is the context of your life. If you live 1900 to 1970, like my father did, totally different living 1936 to today. The last 40 years have been unprecedented. People don't realize 1983, Dow Jones was 600. It's now 30,000.
Wow.
Think about that. The change.
Yeah.
The house we bought this piece of land I'm living in, it's gone up 30 times since I bought it, 30 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, that we live, I don't know if there's another period of history that's been as positive as this particular period. It has its bumps. Nothing's ever simple, but we've had a huge interest costs alone have gone down from the 1980s to today. They've turned around now, but so it's an interesting experience. But let people understand that each period of history is a little different, where you are and so forth. Obviously, the different parts of the world you're in is very important too.
Okay. You know what? We have a couple minutes left, and we talked earlier, just briefly, you mentioned your wife, Barbara. Your book talks about that relationship, how that began, didn't happen, and then you end up getting married. She was somebody that you knew. You were a lot older than her, right?
Well, her brother was
years
a classmate, a year younger than me at Rochester. And
yeah,
she was 7 years younger. He was the second editor of the humor magazine, which I founded, which I could spend some time on, which is really fun. It was my first discovering my real passion. But anyway, I went to the house, and after I left there, after 3 days, she told her mother she was going to marry me. She was 14. 6 years later, I became the best man at his wedding. And by the way, get that free trip to California, but I ended up I worked for that company, and I was there for 10 years. And I married the bridesmaid.
You did end up going to work for the company.
Really funny story, but anyway. But Barbara's been in my partner section. You got to find someone to love. Find someone who will pay attention to you. Find someone you can support. Someone who will support you. Tell you you're not standing up straight. You got mustard on your face. Those are the things. And Barbara and I were married 57 years, and she's really a partner. And she's helped me make decisions. We're going to leave Nantucket. She says, don't leave Nantucket. We'll just build a golf course. And I built a golf course, which that's not crazy. I came back and said, sell the house. I can't get any of the clubs. She said, build a golf course. And now the golf course is one of the things on the island. And she's raised 3 children, and she has that whole other area. We do have a division of labor. She makes me look great. She gets all the cards, and I sign them all. And all the kids think that I'm really paying attention to them. And I try to pay attention to them, but she makes me pay attention to them. And she really is a great partner for everything I do. And I look back at decisions we made them together, but she's very different. She's artistic, and I'm scientific, and I was an athlete, and she wasn't an athlete. She now plays golf. She struggled with that for a long time. But so it's a real partnership, and it's been a great partnership. And I think that people should recognize that it's the ultimate for life. And when you're all done, what you end up is family and friends, and the most important part of your family is your partner. And I have these three kinds of partners that I ask people to have. One, find people who can do things you can't do. Find people who can do things better than you can do. Find people that can do things you do well, but you don't want to do. And Barbara fills in a lot of things I don't want to do. She does things I can't do. She's very artistic. We built a couple of houses. I'm great in spatial relations. I am lousy in colors and organization and things like that. She does that. So we're really partners. And it's been a great thing. And she really focuses on the children and the grandchildren. For example, she makes a Christmas stocking for each one of the children and grandchildren every year. It's like in needlepoint. It's like painting a bridge. When you get done with the year, you got to start the other end again. Start over again. But she's very sensitive to this. And she's also much more sensitive to just things in general than I am. And that's very important. We balance out pretty well. And that's important. It's luck, a lot of luck. But it really was it's very important to have a partner like that. If you can find one, I'd recommend it highly.
Okay. Well, she was cute, right?
Oh, she was cute. She was young, and the first time I called her up when I was up at school, I said, "Would you like to come to Harvard?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "I'll fix you up with someone your own age," and I did.
Yeah, but then you ended up
dating I dated her once, and then I proposed to her underneath the Golden Gate Bridge at the Fort Point.
Okay. There you go. So what's next for you? You're going to sit around on your front porch and sip tea?
No, my next is talking to guys like you. I wrote one book and I've sold a bunch of it. And the next one, this next one's going to be, I think, I'm hoping that it'll do well and maybe even have an animated film out of it. What's next is communicating this life that I've had to people to convince them that anything is possible. I'm getting letters back from young people saying, one woman wrote me and said her daughter was just moribund. She's just laying around. And she read your book, and now she's going to college. I got a letter the other day from a gal, freshman at Notre Dame, and said part of the reason she's there is because she had a meeting with me at Northeastern. This is it's a great experience for me. It's very satisfying. I don't know where it ends. I'm still involved in the market every day. I get up in the morning at 6:30, and I spend an hour and a half reading the news. With Zoom, it's been great because all my investment clubs have invited me back in. I have about 4 of those a week. I'm actually still the chairman of a company in Boston, although I'm so friggin' old, I don't think that they're going to get rid of me one of these days. And I have a couple consulting contracts that I work. I play golf a couple times a week. So I'm not going to sit. I'll give you the whole story. My secretary for 29 years called my wife about 6 months ago and said, "Is he ever going to retire?" And she said, "I don't think so." So my secretary just retired.
Every time I do a podcast, which I do weekly, my wife says to me, "I thought you were going to retire." And I said, "Well, this is my retirement."
No, I'm having a good time. I don't overwork. Yeah. I like 10 o'clock calls rather than 8 o'clock calls. And Zoom has done a wonderful. Fox News asked me to come out to Chicago. I would not go to 8 o'clock meeting in Chicago for Fox News for my book, but the Zoom, no problem. And technology has helped an awful lot. So this is what's next, really. I don't know where it's going to take me completely. One of these days, I'd love to write a real fictional book, because I never read any fiction at all until about 3 years ago. And I don't know if Audible has just changed my life. I've listened to over 115 different titles in the last year or 2 years. It's just, to me, it changed. I walk every day. I used to hate the walk. Okay. Now I love it. I can't wait to get there because, Leon Uris and Ken Follett and now Wilbur Smith. And these people, I always reject them because I always said, life is much better than fiction. But I'd reject the fiction completely. But some of the stuff is really. Yeah. And in today's world, between Wordle and reading, and I'm also taking Spanish now, something called Duolingo. Duolingo is great. It's a language app that's just fabulous. And I spoke Spanish at one point in time when I worked in Central America. and picking it up again is fun. So there's so many things you can do today, and I'm doing them. So I suspect I'm hoping that they carry me out at the last minute and I don't go down too bad before then. But still then, that's what's next. What's next, though, is really the book. I want to see where it really takes me. Because publishing, to me, is still a mystery. And why some books sell and why others books don't sell. And they don't give you any information at all. I'm at least 9 months back on how many books I've sold.
Wow. Okay. It's been great talking to you. Where can people find your books?
Amazon and Simon & Schuster. You can go to my website, which is unfortunately pretty robust. There's a push to buy the book. You just type my name into Amazon and you get both my books. And I'd love you to see a pre-order a little bit. The second book, we get a little pre-order and make my publisher happy.
Okay. All right. Ed Hajim, thank you so much for being with us on Lean to the Left. It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed talking to you and going over all these stories about your career. I think people can learn a lot. So I thank you for being with us.
Bob, thank you for having me.
Guys, I hope you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you learned something as well. Please come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. Our interview shows stream weekly on Wednesdays, and you can check out the schedule of upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. You can also subscribe to our audio version there or to our video shows here at YouTube. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at BobGaddy_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we and our guests comment on the latest developments in the news and about the social issues that concern us all. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.